Namaste, dzień dobry, assalamu alaikum, ciao, konnichiwa, bonjour, hola. This is Tenant 10. A very good morning to you. Hello and welcome to another edition of Tenant 10. How are you? I hope you're well. We are James Alexander. We broadcast live every day from Southwest London, Southwest 16 Norbury to be precise, which is between Streatham that way to the north and Croydon to the south. We sell and let properties and manage a lot too. Today I wanted to talk about our broken system of housing in the UK. The irony of the whole thing is just infuriating, and it doesn't seem anybody's got an answer. And the answers that have been provided due to an influx of a new housing minister every minute, it seem to be inadequate, to say the least. A good example of that is a situation where a landlord finds that the tenant can no longer afford the rent, so therefore has to, for instance, perhaps they're working. This is a typical example. And then all of a sudden they find they can't pay the rent, so they have to apply for housing support from the local authority. Now, that housing support will not be enough to cover the rent because the private market rents and the local authority bandings are different. So then the tenant approaches the local authority only part pays the rent. The landlord realizes the account slipping into arrears, still has the same mortgage to pay, often which was based on the open market rent, not what the local authority feels it should pay, finds himself in a position where they can no longer afford the mortgage. So what do? Well, they serve a notice on the tenant once the rent goes more than 8 weeks into arrears, generally speaking, called a Section 8 Ground 8 notice, which says that there are 8 weeks rent outstanding. The tenant then takes that notice typically to the local authority and says, look, I need rehousing, my landlord is evicting me. The local authority says to the tenant, actually, don't worry, it'll take ages, stay put, stay where you are, because we won't help you until you get evicted. So the tenant then explains this to the landlord. Landlord understands and then carries on with the procedure. Some 6 to 12 months later, depending on which local authority you're in, the matter will end up in court. Assuming all the notices are right and everything's correct, the landlord will get possession because Section 8 Ground 8, that is that there are 8 weeks arrears at the point when the notice was served and 8 weeks when the hearing was. If those two things are correct and all the notices are served correctly, then it's a mandatory ground, meaning the judge has to give possession. So now the judge gives possession. At last, you think, for the landlord? Not quite. Tenant goes back to the local authority and the local authority say, yeah, not quite. We need you to actually wait for the bailiffs. So then they explain that to their landlord. The landlord says, well, okay, then applies to the bailiff and pays another fee. Once they've done that, it will be many weeks before the bailiffs can attend because guess what? They're busy. And then when the tenant has this bit of paper that says the bailiffs are arriving on a certain date, they'll go back to the local authority. They'll then be obliged to actually house that tenant, especially the more vulnerable ones, and quite rightly so. I'm not against that at all. But the problem is this: the accommodation they then provide will be far more expensive than the original rent that they wouldn't pay for the accommodation that the tenant's being kicked out of. So we find ourselves in a situation where now the local authority is spending more money on temporary accommodation when they could have just said to that tenant, what is the shortfall? How can we help to bridge that gap? And we might be in a better position than we are now. Just a thought, but there we are. So how are you today? Apart from that, on a lighter note, things are still selling. We had a couple of deals all agreed yesterday, which I'm delighted to see. And as I mentioned yesterday as well, interest rates are calming down. The longer term rates and projections are looking better. Of course, this week, all eyes are on the Chancellor's autumn statement. And we look forward to it. We dread it coming up this week, don't we? So looking forward to that. And obviously you'll hear what we think of that, both on our podcast in some detail, and in the meantime, we'll talk to you about it as the news comes in. I don't think I've ever heard a more heavily leaked one than this. It looks like capital gains tax is going to be the big hit, and we'll explain how that might affect you if you're a property investor as that news comes in. So thanks very much for watching. Look after yourselves and your friends and family if you can. Ciao.